Hi, my name is Mark Yuskowitz. I'm editor-at-large for MM&M, and welcome to today's webinar, How Physicians' Content Preferences Impact Specialty Targeted Advertising. We're sponsored by Wolters Kluwer Health, and before I hand things over to Mike Andrews, who's VP of Sales and head of the Lippincott HCP Access team at Wolters Kluwer Health, I'll just say a few words to let you know what to expect. As viewers of this webinar know, especially if they're regular readers of MM&M, physicians are constantly changing up the mix of professional content that they consume to keep up with the field. And these preferences differ from one group of specialists to the next. They also impact doctors' perceptions around promotional content. In this webinar, Mike will discuss where clinicians are spending their time online, insights from a proprietary survey on physicians' content preferences and biggest challenges with content, and in light of those insights, how to tweak your multimedia campaigns to drive success with targeted provider groups, and to do so on budget. Mike's been working in the advertising industry for over 20 years, including about 7 years leading sales teams at WebMD Medscape, so I know you'll gain a lot from his presentation. Just before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. This is a 45-minute webcast with about 30 minutes for Mike's content, and there'll be roughly 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So be sure to submit your questions through the webinar dashboard, and we'll queue it up for Mike. So I'll now hand things over to you, Mike, for your presentation, and I'll be back on to moderate the Q&A portion. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome everyone to our webcast today. I'm very excited to share some of our research that we're doing here at Lippincott HCP Access to understand better physicians and how they consume content as a large academic publisher. But I'd just like to say, we've just gone through 2.5 years of a pandemic, and I don't want to bore you with another new normal presentation. But some of the habits that we acquired during the past 2.5 years have stuck and some have gone away. And this is true for physicians as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those changes today. And if you just think about yourselves, I know I finally cut the cord in the midst of the pandemic and now watch everything through my devices. And there's just a lot of changes that have happened. And we need to remember that physicians are people too, and they also change with the times. So today I'm going to talk about platform diversity, so the different places in which physicians engage. We're going to talk about shifts in credibility, both within platform and in content type. I'm going to then move into influencing the path to care, which I know a lot of you are brand managers or work at some of the agencies that work with HCP marketing or work at a hospital or health system in the marketing department, med device pharma. And influencing the path to care is one of the most important things when you think about your marketing and media campaigns, and finally taking action on those messages. So we're going to talk about content preferences, but also how it's applicable to what we do in our everyday lives. I know wake up every morning and I think, how could I engage physicians better? How can I help them on the path to providing better patient outcomes? And that is, in fact, one of the missions of Wolters Kluwer Health. We believe very firmly in providing physicians with deep engagement so that they are providing best-in-class care for their patients. And that's part of who we are as a company. So as I started this endeavor, the first thing I thought about is, how do we break through the clutter? As a publisher of over 400 different sites and journals, this is something we have to do each and every day. And so doctors are overwhelmed with all of the personal and professional things in their lives. And even now, I have a lot of doctors who I'm friends with, doctors who are in my family, and they're getting now texted by their patients. They're getting emailed by their patients. And so they are overwhelmed and strapped for time. And at the same time, science is moving faster than ever. We saw with COVID that those vaccines happen faster than anyone expected. Maybe not as fast as the public thinks is appropriate, but faster than the scientific world thought could have happened. And with science moving so quickly and the overwhelming nature of these positions, how do we break through the clutter, and how do we reach these physicians in a meaningful way? The first step I took when I joined Lippincott about 1.5 years ago was I started working with Kantar to understand content consumption habits. and where they spend time online. And so the majority of this will be about digital content consumption, but I'll talk about it a little more holistically as well. Here we're looking at this straight from Kantar, and what surprised me is 1 in 4 HCPs are going online to read peer-reviewed journals. I was expecting newsletters to spike really high. I was expecting medical websites to spike really high in terms of their time online. I'm not surprised that industry websites are not top of the list, but I was surprised with peer review specifically, that they're spending time online there. And so I wanted to see, as an academic publisher, what that means for us. And so at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, we fielded an online survey, and we wanted to reach at least 1,000 physicians, because we wanted to be able to cut the data by specialty, whether you're an orthopedist, whether you're a neurologist, oncologist, et cetera. So we got 1,000 respondents, and we also deployed it blinded under Health Med Research. We didn't want people to feel like it was biased coming from an academic publisher. And we also made sure that we surveyed a list of people that were above and beyond our normal subscribers, so they weren't ultimately biased by who we are and already believe in us. So we used DMD to be a third-party list to include both our people and people outside of our list. So we did this survey to understand better content consumption habits, not only to help our advertising partners, but also to help our user experiences of the websites that we publish, as well as the tools that we publish from Ovid to UpToDate. What is not surprising is that there's more platforms out there for advertisers to use, because doctors are using more platforms than ever, especially in the digital space. And we all know that budgets are the same. Very rarely does someone say, oh, and now, because doctors are using podcasts more, we should have a new podcast budget. No, you have to carve it out from somewhere. So we wanted to understand, from a clinical content perspective, where you prefer to consume content. And we were actually surprised that text-based content is, in fact, overwhelmingly the preferred way in which physicians want to consume clinical content. 85% was quite surprising. I also felt that video was still quite low throughout the pandemic. I was expecting that to spike a little bit more. But it's still around 1 in 4 physicians seeing video as important in terms of reading clinical content or viewing clinical content. What did strike me was audio was overshadowing video, not only as a new content type for clinical content. There weren't clinical focused podcasts many years ago. But it is now 1 in 4 physicians are using this platform. And that's something we're thinking about at Wolters Kluwer Health. We have a whole division devoted towards high quality audio CME through Audio Digest and LDI. And we wanted to understand a little bit more about why this was spiking. But very interesting here. And again, we can always cut this data by different specialties. Orthopedists always score very highly among video, while, say, neurologists or cardiologists are more apt to be more text-based. But these are the overall numbers, and they don't vary that dramatically. Surgeons tend to care more about video than other specialties. And so we then wanted to understand a little bit more about what they're doing in terms of the objections that they have to reading the content. What is holding them back from reading more or consuming more? And unsurprisingly, they don't have enough time. We all don't have enough time, but physicians really don't have enough time. And when we think about content formats, we realize that curation is key, that physicians do want a level of curation so that they can consume more of the highlights of the research that's out there if they're not digging into the clinical trial results. So it makes sense that they feel like there's too much to read and it's in too much of a long form. And one of the things we're working on, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, is user experience, UX, of our websites. And we've done a fairly good job sort of trying to connect the dots so that doctors can find relevant articles to what they're reading. one of the things that we've started building out is when we do webcasts, making sure that the supporting articles and research in and around what that webcast is there and available for consumption. So finding relevant articles is definitely something that we're working to do better with. What surprised me as well is on one hand, they have too much content to read, but on the other hand, 1 in 5 say they don't have access to the content that they need. And so what that says to me is that while there is a ton of great free content out there, the most valuable content tends to be gated in some way, the paid for content they wish they had access to. And that is something that we're trying to work on as well with new open access journals and a focus on open access, making sure that content is available as soon as the research happens, as well as making content more discoverable and easy to find. We have tons of archived content that's still sound medicine, but it's not necessarily discoverable. So those are things that we're working on to make sure that physicians find what they need. Another thing that's different is we're seeing 16% is quite high for physicians saying that the content that they're reading is not credible. So we're going to spend some time talking about credibility. The pandemic has been very odd for all of us, and how to trust the medical community and what's going on within hospitals. And with the federal government for that matter. But physicians are becoming much more suspicious of the content that they're reading and much more distrustful. So we're going to talk a little bit about credibility and what it means to you as a brand manager or as an agency partner. But first, we wanted to dig into not just the platforms that they're using, but also the different types of content. I've done surveys like this before, and I'm not surprised that, in terms of content for a doctor to stay up to date on practice, stay up to date for their practice, CME always spikes. It's always number one or close to number one. What struck me is we did this as a digital survey, but we did include print journals here as an option just to see. And I was very surprised that it came in second because I don't know about all of you, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I was taking all my magazines and spraying them down with Lysol and canceling things so I didn't have as much mail. But through the pandemic, because of the quality of the content, and we'll talk about the value of peer review a little bit later on, printed journals definitely are an important piece of the puzzle. There's a lot in here. I'm going to pick out a couple other highlights. One is because of the increase of usage of podcasts for clinical purposes, we did ask a follow-up question. And, when you think about general market and, I listen to podcasts, I'm a diehard NPR listener. But I listen to my podcast through iTunes and Spotify. It wouldn't occur to me to try and listen to them anywhere else. That's just what I do, what the majority of Americans do. But doctors are a little bit different. Again, there's more distrust in the sorts of content being published in the medical space. And so, I was really shocked that 1 in 3 are accessing podcasts direct from their sites, from the publisher sites. They want to find quality audio from institutions and places that they trust. And this is bearing out in the data here. Very rarely do you see the average, consumer consuming audio content through a platform that wasn't one of, iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, Google. But in our space for HCPs, this is different. They are looking for quality podcasts, but they are looking for who's publishing them. The other thing that struck me here is there was before the pandemic, there was a huge movement of doctors going to social media sites and connecting online. We're finding that is in decline. 70% in decline for this survey. While CME, print journals, discussion with colleagues, and conferences are up. And so that is a big shift for social media. And again, if you think about the landscape of America and what's happening and the distrust of the sorts of news that people read in social media platforms, that's also tainting the medical social media platforms that are out there. And when we described what is a medical social media website in the survey, we did include, the more professional focused social media websites. And I think, when you're talking about what people use, you're thinking about what are the most credible sources. And I wanted to really understand what was the impact from COVID on places like the CDC and the NIH, which we really see as like the gold standard for trust and credibility in the healthcare space. And when we asked physicians if they had a change in confidence, overwhelmingly, we're seeing a decrease in confidence in the CDC and the NIH. And we're seeing an increase in confidence in medical societies. As an academic publisher, we wanted to understand a little bit more about this because we have seen a huge increase in our traffic over the past couple of years throughout the pandemic. When I started at Wolters Kluwer, we were under 40 million monthly uniques across all of our journal sites. And most of our journal sites are associated with medical societies like the American Heart Association, the American Academy of Neurologists, ASCO, et cetera. So we wanted to understand why physicians were turning to us in large numbers. It was under 40 million monthly uniques. Now we're up to 55 million monthly uniques, and that's just in 12 months. There's been a huge shift in physicians wanting to consume trusted, credible content. And this shows part of what's happened because of COVID is this shift towards trusting the nonprofit societies and their messaging more than just the federal government. Very, very curious that this has happened, and independent societies are really benefiting from a traffic perspective, but even more so, all of their amazing quality content is being consumed and providing for better patient outcomes. Digging in even more to credibility, we asked specifically online, what types of content are the most credible? Overwhelmingly, they said peer-reviewed content online was the most credible. And peer review is how research gets published. And so there is a certain extra layer of validation that the content is medically accurate. Versus say general medical websites or specialty medical websites. Of course, social media networks, those physician-based social media networks, only 3% included them. And then we had like an open box where physicians could put in whatever they wanted to of why they picked what they picked. And the reasons why they said that peer review was the most credible had to do with, evidence-based content, clinical guidelines, new data and research, best practices, really juicy information that could help them really treat their patients and provide for better patient outcomes. General medical websites, they had a lot of general science and knowledge, medical news, quick reference. And finally, the social media networks, it was the only one that got multiple people saying do not use. But those who do use it say that they can get consensus opinions, clinical experience, and pearls. So again, interesting feedback from the HCPs on the different platforms that are out there, and also the diversity within the digital space. It's not just digital versus traditional. It's not just digital versus audio or video. It's also the kinds of content within the digital space that can provide for changes in practice behavior, especially if you're trying to do script lift or market share shift. If those are your KPIs above and beyond awareness, where the context of where you're placing your ads matters quite a big deal. In this landscape, I'm focusing on credibility because pharma, med device right now, and actually to some degree, hospitals and health systems through the pandemic have had a decrease in public perception of them as institutions. And so you want to make sure not only are you advertising in the right place that people are going to take action, but you also want to make sure that you're in a brand safe environment where you might get the halo of the environment that you're in, the brand halo. So I just talked a little bit about influencing practice behavior. We know that as advertisers, that is what you care about the most. Brand managers care most about influencing the path to care for patients, influencing how doctors prescribe to their patients, whether they use devices as part of their new protocols. And this is where I was a bit surprised by the result. Usually when you ask about trust and credibility, CME goes to the top. But when you talk about influence, peer review actually beats it out. Only by a couple percentage points, but that is different. That peer review is definitely an spiking as an important piece of the path to care. for how physicians make their decisions to change practice behavior. And this changes by specialty. And so I pulled out just some information, in the orthopedic space, they rely heavily on peer-reviewed content. And this is where, the challenges of a marketer come into play, because on one hand, you cut the data, you see orthopedists love video, but video isn't by definition mostly peer review. But then you also see that they rely heavily on peer review. So, it makes for an interesting challenge for a marketer. Still very high, peer review remains very high for every specialty. Oncology, there's just a wealth of websites and information out there in that space right now. So it's not as much of a priority, but it still is a priority. It's a very important part of Path to Care. Inversely, news, perspectives, and commentary, which is the majority of content that is published every day online for doctors, is not something that actually influences the path to care. And so while it may drive a large number of clicks and engagements, that doesn't necessarily mean that content is driving changes to practice behavior. And so wanted to include that in here to just show the comparison there. We took it a step further because we wanted to force rank the physicians to say what is the most influential. And that's where peer review really comes out on top. 70% of the respondents indicated that peer review was the most influential or the second most influential content type that they consume, which is really incredible as part of the path to care for many patients. Physicians are going to think about new treatments based on the real research that backs up the science of how they're prescribing or how they're diagnosing patients. So peer review is incredibly influential in determining the path to care. And I just sort of want to wrap up this conversation to talk about the impact advertising has on physicians. And so we asked them directly. we said, when you see ads adjacent to content, what are you most likely to do? What actions are you most likely to take? And, fielding a variety of our partnerships, obviously clicks are important. Visits to your website are important. Contacting a detail rep, very important in terms of changes to prescribing habits. We know that that's part of the path to care. Recommending a product to another physician. And finally, printing and saving the ad. We often think about, in the academic publishing space, printing out an article, absolutely. But printing out an ad, that is something they will do. They will save and print it, which is surprising. That is an action they're taking. But when we asked them overwhelmingly, and we looked only in the digital space here and the various outlets that are around, overwhelmingly, online medical journal sites are where they take action the most after seeing the ads. And this is not surprising to me. And you go back to the idea of influence and trust and credibility. Well, how do they build up that influence and trust and credibility on their sites versus other sites? And many of the agency partners on the call probably are putting their fist up in the air saying, oh, academic publishers, sometimes they're hard to work with. Well, that's because we reject many ads. Not all ads get published. It's not tons of ads, but we have a certain extra layer of approval that happens where if your ads get vetted out by the society before they go published on our site, the doctors know that the society has approved not just the content on their sites, but they've also approved the ad. So it's gone through MLR and then an extra layer and vetting through the nonprofit societies. And so when they see the ads adjacent to the content from the journals, the medical journals, they are more likely to trust the science that's backing the claims within those ads. And look, it doesn't happen every day. I've probably had a handful of cases that we've rejected an ad since I've been here in a year, but we've made recommendations and then those ads have been republished on the site and all better for it, that the doctors now see the credible promotions from our industry partners. And you can see, versus general medical websites and also versus social media, that they're more likely to take action in an environment where they feel like, their mindset in the academic journal space is, how do I better my practice? how do I provide better patient outcomes for the conditions that I treat, whether it's, total joint replacement or epilepsy or diabetes or heart failure. When they are reading the content in an online medical journal website, they're actually, that's the purpose. That's the goal. That's the mindset of the physician in that space. So we have this research. It is many more questions that I included in here. But I wanted you guys to take away the idea that platform matters, credibility matters, and the impact that the platform and the content and the types of content matter in terms of influencing the path to care. It really does matter when you're trying to find what partners you work with for your advertising programs. So you can always reach out to me. We can cut the data by specialty if your brand focuses on just a particular condition. And we have a lot of first-party data by condition by HCP. So thank you for attending this webcast. I hope you learned a little bit about the variety of content types that HCPs and physicians are reading online and how they've changed through the pandemic. My biggest takeaway is that reliable, academically vetted content has become more of a premium for physicians, which has driven to our huge increases in traffic year over year. So we're now going to shift to the Q&A section.
Thank you, Mike. That was a really great talk about where clinicians are spending their time online. And insights about their content preferences and their biggest challenges with the content, and sort of kind of getting into that mix in terms of the path to care if you're a brand manager or you're an agency partner. So speaking of that, I would open it up now to the audience to enter some questions for Mike that you might have about how to act on those insights, how to tweak your multimedia campaigns to drive success with these provider groups and do so in budget. So just to start you off with a quick question here, Mike, we didn't talk that much about measurement, but when you're evaluating tactics for a media plan, how do you match the KPI with the platform or the content type? And how do you recommend assessing your results?
Sure. Look, I would say the bread and butter of what we've historically worked with here at Lippincott HCP Access is mostly awareness campaigns, and making sure that, all the members of the AAN know the name of the brand and what condition it's treating. And so when I think about the platform, you have to look at reach, and then you have to look at frequency. How many times are they engaging with the content in your ad, and how integral is the content in their day-to-day practice? So reach and frequency are very important when thinking about platform for awareness. But when you start to get into changes in practice behavior and influencing practice behavior, deep engagement is definitely a piece of the puzzle. And we've found with IQVIA studies, or whether you're using Crossix Pixels, that when physicians are leaning forward into, say, a podcast or a webinar or a roundtable or a resource center, something where there is that level of curation. I talk about how doctors want a level of curation, a level of synthesizing of the various research that is out there. We're finding that in those environments where they're really leaning forward, that does a lot of the heavy lift for changes in practice behavior, script lift, market share shift, in addition to sort of the bread and butter awareness that a lot of advertisers do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. This is a question from Sophie. Doctors often are hesitant to change their ways. Have you seen what are the best ways to convince doctors to change?
So I would say that doctors are hesitant to change their ways, but they are human like everyone else. We've tried to do age-related surveys that see whether there's differences between the thought leader, KOL, baby boomer, chief of surgery versus the newly millennial at the beginning of the middle of their careers in their early 40s now. And the reality is everyone's addicted to their phones. Not one doctor isn't addicted to their phone. And so I think there is a perception that physicians aren't changing how they're consuming content. The fact is, the type of content they're consuming is not changing. You're not going to get a doctor to stop reading clinically relevant content vetted by peer review. They're still going to read that. And we're seeing a lot of them are still reading the printed publications. But when you think about the digital space, doctors are going online and in huge numbers. And I would say the majority of them are doing both. They're going to live conferences and reading printed journals, but they're also in large numbers each and every day logging on and consuming podcast videos and article-based content online. So there's a perception that doctors haven't changed their behaviors, but the stats say otherwise, whether they're an older physician or a younger physician.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a sentiment or a notion that I hear a lot of marketers say, is that we're trying to help clinicians change behavior that oftentimes is not necessarily rooted in evidence-based medicine, and kind of shifting the or impacting their hesitancy to change their clinical habits. But they have to keep up. I mean, that's equally important.
Yeah,
as
I would
that
say
notion
changing.
of wanting to keep up.
Yeah, and
Go
I
ahead,
was
sorry.
thinking more about the platform conversation than changing practice behavior. You need evidence-based information for someone to change practice behavior. I've spent a lot of time working in the oncology space, and I feel like, we as marketers have done a good job of introducing immunotherapy to medical oncologists and hematologists, introducing CAR T therapy to them. And these are now personalized medicine is now part of the path to care for most patients with cancer. That's just a reality now. And, part of that is due to marketing. And so when you're in a different discipline, whether it's cardiology or orthopedics, I think you can change practice behavior through marketing, through advertising. You just need to have the types of content that are deeply engaging. And there is a lot of clinical content being written, published, and mea culpa, as an academic publisher, a lot of it's not discoverable. A lot of it has been published, and during the pandemic, physicians don't know that they missed something that has been published, and it's our jobs as marketers not just to raise the bar in talking about how maybe our products work, but also talk about treatments generally speaking have changed. How you treat a joint replacement is totally different today than it was, say, 25 years ago. And it's not just oncology that is having innovation. It's actually innovations happening in every discipline. And it's a matter of elevating the types of content that are going to drive practice behavior changes, which I think that content needs to be, rooted in research and data and clinical trial results.
Sure, yeah. You mentioned the platform diversity and hinted at how that differs for different specialties, orthopedists and surgeons preferring video and so forth. Do the results differ for different age cohorts? Is that something you measured as well?
We didn't measure it in this particular study. I've measured it in other studies before, and it's not that different. When you get a KOL who's really, really popular, lead a podcast conversation, you're going to get every age group wanting to listen to that KOL. And that's why I talk about the different types of content that are out there. If the podcast is, just about news of the day, people might listen to it. But if the podcast is rooted in science, research, and perspective from a KOL, you're going to get the KOL's peers listening to that podcast. So, one could argue that millennial physicians are more connected online, and older, more KOL, chief of surgeries are less engaged online, but they're still consuming content. We can see it through the logins. Like, they're still consuming content online. Not much difference.
Sure. Okay, interesting. These are great questions, by the way. So I would invite the audience to please keep your questions coming. For Mike, we've got several more minutes here open. open phone lines, as they say on the talk shows. Um, this question comes from Sally. What clinical specialties were included in the research that you presented, Mike?
Oh, sure. So we did the major ones, cardiology, neurology, oncology, orthopedists. We did urology. We did plastic surgery. We did anesthesiologists. We did most everyone. I did not include NPPAs, which I regret now, so I'm going to include them for the next round. But it was primarily a physician-based survey. And we included most specialties. I sent it out to a full list of specialties. Some of them, we can cut the data and be statistically accurate. Some of it, there just weren't enough respondents. So you might use it as a guide than necessarily fully accurate. But for most of them, we got a good cohort to be statistically accurate, especially for the major ones that industry is interested in.
Sure, based on your experience. Can you put your contact info up on the screen? I'm not sure if that's up there yet.
I don't think it's in this deck. You can find me at michael.andrews@walterskluwer.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, so if you just put in Michael Andrews Walters Kluwer, I will pop up. And you can always go to those lovely media kits that we publish for all of our printed journals. If you submit something in our submission form, it ends up on my desk at some point or another. But for everyone included here, we'll make sure that we email out contact information to everyone who's attending.
Great. And by the way, were all the clinical specialties specialists that you surveyed, were they all U.S. based?
They're U.S. based specialists, and there is primary care in there. So we did include primary care, internal medicine, et cetera.
Okay, great. One of the really interesting findings from one of your earlier slides was that 16% of doctors said they have a credibility issue with online content, and you mentioned that physicians are becoming more, distrustful or skeptical of the content they read, and you kind of put it out there in terms of what are the implications for brand managers and agency partners. And given that misinformation and disinformation is such a big issue, I wanted to ask if you could kind of elaborate on that a little bit. What does that finding mean for brand managers and agencies?
Sure. I think there's just a lot of distrust because of how the messaging of the pandemic to the general public occurred. And I think that bled into physicians. I also feel like as a brand manager, very recently, we've seen the FDA approve drugs that a full panel of physicians have said should not be approved. And so there is this idea of a corrupting influence of industry within the medical community. And even from a federal government standpoint, they're looking at ways to curtail industry's ability to market and advertise. Now, I don't want to weigh in on the politics of it all, but what I will say for anyone who's representing a pharmaceutical brand or representing a med device company, I think it's more important than ever to feel altruistic and lean into that. You want to have your ads in an environment where doctors are feeling like you're a good steward and a good citizen. And so when you lean into educational products, when you lean into capabilities where you're not just saying, hey, I'm X brand and I should be known for X condition, yes, you may get that awareness. But if you actually teach them something that will help them change how they practice medicine and really treat their patients better, they're going to see a much more positive, see you in a much more positive light. So I highly recommend, deep engagement products for that. And also the environment in which you host those deep engagement products. They don't make them feel like advertising, make them feel like scientific education, So I think there's a big shift towards that. If you're worried about your your brand per se, not just the product's brand, but the brand of the manufacturer. I think those sorts of things are incredibly important to physicians at the very least.
Sure, sure. Just a few minutes left here for questions. One of the other really interesting things that you mentioned toward the end of your presentation, Mike, was about brand safety, and that's not really an issue when you're talking about peer-reviewed content. I mean, what clinical brand doesn't want to be juxtaposed, their promotion or ad juxtaposed with peer-reviewed science, but it's interesting that the societies are going in the other direction, kind of vetting the ads that they're willing to accept that are going to appear side by side with the journal content. And you mentioned it doesn't happen too often, but it has happened that ads are kind of rejected, or you kind of go back to the advertisers and say, hey, can you tweak this a little bit? How can you kind of elaborate on that point a bit?
Sure. No one likes to be told that you want to work with us, and then we say, "Oh, well, you got to make some changes," and that's always a fun conversation. But everyone is used to it; it exists. It definitely exists, and it's fairly easy. We go to the society who has a medical board, and we then submit the ads to that medical board. They then review them, and if there is a claim that they feel like is not bearing in the clinical trial results, they'll then send back with recommendations, ways to adjust the messaging within the advertisement. That is why physicians take more action on the ads in our environment, because they know that they have been vetted and looked at even more carefully than our federal government did through the MLR process. So they like that independence of the nonprofit societies doing that, and it's more painless than you would imagine.
Are the societies getting more sensitive? I'm sorry.
No, actually, I would say that societies are not more or less sensitive. They're just going through their process that they've always gone through. I would say, though, that they are loosening up where ads are within their websites. We now are able to have adjacency to articles. We're now able to have adjacency to curated content by condition. There are a variety of things we're now able to do that we haven't been before. We talked a little bit about ROI, and we're now able to do audience verification, confirming which physicians engaged with which content. We're now able to do a lot more than we ever have in the past as we've invested in our platforms and what's out there. There's a ruling with the AACME saying that publishers now can help with the development of content with industry and with CME accreditation. That was not the case last year. So we have a lot of capabilities to help develop content in addition to promoting that content and promoting that advertising. So who better to turn to help educate physicians on a new way to treat a condition than a journal that's part of a society that's most respected by the specialty.
I did not know about that AACME rule. I'll have to check that out. Just one other question, and we'll let you go, Mike, here. Why is social media decreasing? That was one of the other points that I was really fascinated by. I know you said you included the real professional social media platforms in your survey, but as conferences and discussions with colleagues is increasing, it's interesting to see that's decreasing. And we also know that in and around scientific presentations, ASCO and the like, we see a huge amount of real-time, debate and discussion among clinicians. So can you just elaborate on that point?
Yeah, and I think it matters what the environment is. And so you can see real-time discussion within the apps at the conferences, but they're doing it within the ASCO app. They're not necessarily in the conference app. They do want to communicate and talk to each other. They just are distrustful of social-first platforms. And so there has been a lack of interest in them and in engaging on them in a way that people were expecting. That's my best guess, because yes, doctors do want to engage peer-to-peer. Peer-to-peer is a huge way in which we're developing our products to have doctors communicate with each other and discuss best practices and guidelines. But peer-to-peer doesn't have to live on a social media platform. It can live within a general news site, like a Medscape. It can live within a peer-reviewed journal site or a society site. Peer-to-peer can happen many different places. And I think there's just, because of what's happened with other social media sites, there is just an implicit distrust in that genre of platform right now. I mean, the data says there's a distrust. I'm making some assumptions on why that could be. But it is a good question. Those would be my guesses based on the different research I've read.
Okay. And I lied about the questions. I have one more for you. This one's from Shari, if you don't mind, Mike. She has a burning question here, and then we'll let you go. What about the information that doctors need that's not necessarily well covered in peer-reviewed journals, such as content about health disparities and cultural competency? I won't weigh in on an editorial perspective on that, because I do see that getting better, but I'll let you handle that.
It is a huge issue, absolutely. And we actually have a DEI mission here at Wolters Kluwer Health. And one of the things that I said earlier is a lot of the best content that we have is not discoverable. It's buried and hidden. Unless someone explicitly searches for something, it's not appearing. And I recently launched a new capability that we have called Collections, where we can use an algorithm that does the intersectionality between condition and DEI, and then share all the peer-reviewed articles that are discussing inequity and disparity in care between different groups. So we now can do that, and there is actually quite a bit of content. We're obviously trying to publish more content on that, and we're actively searching for authors who want to publish on those topics. But that content does exist. It is very hard to find. And so we've now created these collections within the Lippincott platform that can house, you can take migraine, you can take, migraine is actually interesting because there's a whole subsection of migraine sufferers who are women and have very specific situations in and around why they get migraines versus men. And so having specific articles surface, say from the Green Journal, from research done through OBGYNs, and housing that with other content in and around migraine and from a neurologist perspective is fascinating, because the research does exist in not large numbers, but some of it does exist. And we're now being able to make it more discoverable and house it together in a way that, again, relevant articles next to each other, meeting those needs that I expressed earlier in the presentation that doctors want, So we're doing our best to make that capable. But those collections do exist, and we're just beginning to promote them. And they're sponsorable. So if you guys have a DEI mission at your brand and you're looking for partners to work with on that, we definitely have solutions, and we would love the support to help us put this together.
Okay, super. That's wonderful. Okay, great. Well, it's always fascinating to talk to you, Mike. You're a font of knowledge about the academic publishing space. And that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank you for an excellent talk and an overview of recent developments in this field and how brands can better serve doctors' information needs. The session is being recorded and will be available for streaming on demand in the webcast section of our site for a 1-year post-event. If you have any questions, feel free to contact Mike. I think your address is mike.andrews@wolterskluwer.com. Did I get that right?
Michael.andrews@wolterskluwer.com, but you can always call me Mike.
Okay, thank you. And okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.